Good Samaritan Hospital here because one of our church members has a surgery today. So I'm here waiting with them. I also have Presbytery today, so wouldn't be able to do this live at 11 o'clock. For today, basically, we're going to go through the questions and answers for videos 15 through 18. It's going to be a fairly straightforward one, so I won't be on camera a whole lot. I'm primarily going to be showing you the questions and answers so you can get those down. And I'll keep my commentary to a minimum on this one. You get plenty of that in class from me. I will add one important thing, which you will need to know and remember when it comes time for a test. So, with that, let's pray and begin. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we have together. I just pray that you would bless these students as they continue to study world history and Western civilization, that you would bless them and build them up in you. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, let's jump right in. Video number 15 on the Crusades. What misconceptions about the Crusades does John dispel? He actually does a pretty good job with some of this stuff because there are lots of misconceptions about the Crusades that have hung over for a long time. One is that it's a holy war, and the other is that it was about European colonization. It really wasn't either one of those things primarily. Crusades were not primarily a holy war because Christianity does not have a concept of holy war as part of our religious faith. But there was a very strong element of pilgrimage that was part particularly of the medieval Roman Catholic faith. And having just come back from Israel myself, there's still a lot of people for whom pilgrimage is a big deal. Being able to go to the holy places and be able to see things and touch things and kneel before certain things and kiss certain things is still very much an active part of certain people's Christian faith. And so that's why it was more of a pilgrimage. So Pope Urban II, when he launched the First Crusade in 1095, was the idea of we need to come to the aid of our Byzantine brothers who are being harassed by the Seljuk Turks. Excuse me. We also need to, you need to be able to go on pilgrimage. And it was also to make the way of pilgrimage to Jerusalem safe for European Christians who wanted to be able to go there. Because part of the problem that had arisen since Islam had taken over those areas, the Muslims had destroyed many of the Christian churches. They did leave standing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and also the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. So those two were left alone. I got to see both of those. But the rest were pretty much destroyed by the Muslims when they came in the 700s. And so they were trying to rebuild some of the churches and reestablish some of the pilgrimage routes. So it was more about pilgrimage than it was about holy war. Ooh, that's not in order. Let me see here. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Why were the First Crusades more of a pilgrimage than a military operation? Again, sort of answered that question already. They were not an example of early European colonization. This was sort of an old misconception that had hung around for a while, and that was that your younger sons of the nobility, so the way that nobility works is that the first son would inherit everything, and then the second son would go into the church, typically, and become a priest and hope to rise up to become a bishop, and he would have an estate. If you became a bishop, you would have an estate as well. Third sons, fourth sons, well, they were sort of on their own to try to make their way in the world. And so one of the misconceptions from years ago was that the Crusades were primarily about these third and fourth sons of the nobles trying to find and make estates for themselves. And while there were a couple of examples of that, that was the exception rather than the rule. The rule was that most people who responded to the call to crusade were not even knights or noblemen at all, but were just peasants. And generally speaking, the noblemen who did go were firstborn sons or the lords of their estates, and they were not looking for land and territory. They were for the most part sincerely wanting to do it out of conscience, to fight for the cause of Christendom and to open the way for pilgrimage. Which is why you didn't see a huge amount of land grab. Basically, what happened in the Crusades was when they were successful early, all they were trying to do was open up a couple of port cities for ships to be able to come in, and then make sure that what's today Israel, the Holy Land, was kind of secured from Muslim interference. All right, number 5, what struggles and successes did the First Crusaders encounter? They had a lack of adequate supplies for their mission, and so that led to a lot of looting, as they had to rely on getting food and supplies from local populations. There was also not a clear leadership. I should say clear leadership instead of clean leadership. I'm sure the leadership bathed sometimes, but they weren't clear. It wasn't clear who was in charge of the whole operation. You see, the Pope had called for the crusade, but he didn't actually go on the crusade. And he's a pope. He's not a king or a commander. And so there was nobody, one person clearly in charge. And so there was a lot of rivalry and infighting. And then there were great military successes, on the other hand. They did have superior technology. They had stirrups. They had heavy armor. And so when they actually got on the battlefield against the Muslims, they were able to overcome them. Their morale was greatly boosted by the finding of a relic that was said to be a spear that had pierced the side of Christ. And so when they found that, took it as a sign of God's favor and went on to victory, taking Jerusalem. All right, fast forwarding a little bit, the Third Crusade. So what happens is 1099, the Europeans take Jerusalem. And from 1099 to 1187, for those 80, 90 years almost, the Europeans are able to secure the Holy Land. But then in the 1180s, an Egyptian leader arises who's known today as Saladin. And Saladin defeated the Europeans who were there in the Holy Land and recaptured Jerusalem and Damascus. And so the Third Crusade was launched to try to defeat Saladin and try to retake Jerusalem. It did not succeed. And so that was basically the turning point. When the Third Crusade failed, it was really the turning point for the Crusaders, and it was just a matter of time before they would have to leave the Holy Lands altogether. Number 7, what was different and crazy about the Fourth Crusade? So you had a ton of people who volunteered, but only about a third of the people who volunteered actually showed up to fight. So 35,000 people volunteered, and when they had that many volunteers, the kings and the leaders said, we don't want to march that many people across land. That's going to take an incredibly long amount of time. It's going to cost a lot of money. There's going to be a lack of supplies, like they had that problem with the First Crusade. And so they said, well, let's build a bunch of ships. And so they recruited the Venetians, who were the ship-going traders in Italy. And the Venetians built about 500 ships. This was the largest fleet that had been seen in Europe since the days of the Roman Empire. But then only about a third of the Crusaders actually showed up. So there wasn't nearly as much money to fund the expedition as they thought there was going to be. A third of the people, a third of the money. So the Venetians, who had built the ships, didn't get paid. And they said, well, instead of paying us, why don't you help us recapture this rebellious city that has sort of left us, called Zara. And so the Crusaders went and helped the Venetians recapture Zara. Well, Zara was a Christian city, and so these Crusaders actually got excommunicated by the Pope, which is ironic because the whole Crusade thing started in 1095 because Pope Urban II offered a plenary indulgence for anyone who would go on crusade. So far from having all of their sins forgiven and be led straight into heaven when they die, these Crusaders were excommunicated, kicked out of the church, condemned, because they had pillaged and plundered a Christian city. The lasting legacies of the Crusades, according to John Green, it's all negative. The Crusades failed. They drained the resources of Europe. They created conflict between Christians and Muslims. Of course, we know that there was conflict between Christians and Muslims for hundreds of years before this, because it was the Muslims who were the first expansionists who took over Christian territory, namely the Byzantine Empire. So he sees it as all negative. Rodney Stark and the people who make Real Crusades history videos would say that in the end, it created a sense of identity for Christian Europe as Christendom. And so it did have a positive outcome according to their perspective. Visited. Mansa Musa helped begin this gold salt trade. West Africa had lots of gold and no salt. North Africa had lots of salt and no gold. And so they traded gold and salt. At one point in time during this trade, gold and salt were being traded pound for pound, which is kind of crazy to think that West Africa had that much gold and was that desperate for salt. But of course, without salt, especially in a warm climate, all of your meat rots within days. And so salt is really very, very, very important, especially in a warm climate like West Africa. And they had a lot of gold, so they could afford to buy salt with their gold. Islam. So in this video and also in the video about the Indian Ocean trade, one of the things to keep in mind is that when we talk about Muhammad, there are two key things to remember about Muhammad that continues to shape Islam. One is that Muhammad was a merchant, and he came from the Arab peoples who were a merchant people. So trade and mercantilism has been central to the Islamic identity from the very beginning. The other thing is that Muhammad was a very powerful and effective general. So a military, so Islam has been mercantile and has been militant from the very beginning because their founder was a merchant and a general. So wherever there was trade, Islam was able to spread along those trade routes. And so to West Africa, as well as across the Indian Ocean, in those places, Islam was not spread by conquest, by military expansion, but by trade. The first people to embrace Islam were traders, and there was a simple reason for them to do that. It was economically advantageous. If you're trading with a Muslim merchant, if you convert to Islam, you get more favorable trade deals and a better trade relationship. Once enough of the traders and merchants had converted to Islam, the kings and leaders then saw that it was advantageous for them to embrace the economic benefits of becoming Muslim. So this is how Islam spread into West Africa and over into like Indonesia and places across the Indian Ocean. The Kingdom of Mali is one of the places in medieval Africa that we know the most about And that's because of a Moroccan Muslim cleric and scholar named Ibn Battuta. And he visited and he made a very detailed account of his visit. Swahili civilization. Today, Swahili is predominantly associated with East Africa, but it was originally a West African language among the Bantu people. And so Swahili civilization was a collection of city-states that were united by a common trade, language, and religion. And when Swahili migrated from West Africa to East Africa, they brought with them ironworking and agricultural methods, whereas previous to this, East Africa had been primarily hunter-gatherers. Now they became farmers, and because they had iron tools to be able to work the land. So that's a little bit about Swahili. I know we're flying through this stuff, but I just wanted to make sure you had the answers to these questions. And of course, you can pause the video and make sure you get a chance to write them down well. And number 10, when did Swahili civilizations reach their height? Really in the 13th to 16th centuries, when port cities and economies were strengthened by trade. Now, here's my insertion of commentary. You know, you have to have some, right? A huge, huge, huge omission by John Green, one that is just inexcusable, is when talking about Islam in Africa and when talking about trade routes and when talking about merchants, John Green basically ignores the fact that Islam was responsible for beginning the African slave trade, and that Islam traded black Africans as slaves for hundreds of years before Europeans. So if you look at this map, you can see that as early as the 8th century, so in the 700s, so within the first 100 years of there being an Islam, they were already establishing trade routes into Africa and pulling out black African slaves. The transatlantic slave route, which we'll get to later, that doesn't start until the 1500s, really the 1600s, the early 1600s. And the transatlantic African slave route, trade route, particularly among Northern Europeans, Protestants, it only lasts, now it was wrong, it was totally wrong, but it only lasts for about 200 years, from the early 1600s to the early 1800s. The Muslim trade in black African slaves began in the 700s and lasted until really the late 1800s, around 1900, when European powers took over enough areas of Africa that they could put an end to it. The fact that John Green completely ignores Muslim slave trade in Africa is ridiculous, and it shows his heavy bias to try to make Islam look like it's something peaceful and nice, and try to make Christians look like horrible people. All right, video 17 is on the Mongols, and of course we've been hearing about the Mongols all along, right? They're the big exception to all the patterns of human history. And so finally, John Green gets to do a whole video on the Mongols, and he's excited about it. The Mongols are a nomadic people, which makes them different from other types of civilizations that we tend to study. Nomads are people who are herders and not farmers primarily. And so what is key to their civilization is mobility. This ends up really helping the Mongols, because the Mongols, their whole army is on horseback, and they're very good riders. They're able to ride well and shoot from horseback, in part because they're nomads. And nomads have to be able to not only follow their herd, but also be able to hunt very well. And they also typically hunt herd animals. And so once the Mongols learned how to ride horses, they had to learn how to shoot from horseback, which was something that not very many other civilizations could do, particularly non-nomadic civilizations. So nomads migrate according to climate and conditions so they can feed their flocks. They don't produce manufactured goods, which means they have to trade with settled peoples in order to get manufactured goods. They live in nature and in harsh conditions, and they tend to show more respect and give more rights to women because there's more of a division of labor, and more so than there would be like in an established cities and things like that. Genghis Khan, he's really the one who created the Mongol Empire. And Genghis Khan was born Temujin, and he was born around the year 1162. So throughout the video, he talked about Temujin. Temujin is Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan is his title. Temujin is his birth name. Temujin had two innovations that helped him to win the Mongol Civil War and unite the Mongol confederations. And those were promoting people based upon merit and dispossessing the leaders of conquered clans. So it used to be that everything was based upon family and clan, because a clan-based society is all based upon who your family is. And so the same ruling families ruled everything for generation upon generation. Temujin, Genghis Khan, came along and said, it makes more sense to have people in charge who know what they're doing, rather than just have people in charge because of who their father was or who their grandfather was. And then it used to be the case that when you conquered another Mongol clan, you would leave their leadership in place and you would leave their wealth primarily intact as long as they submitted to you. Genghis Khan didn't do this. He completely dispossessed the leaders of the conquered clans, took all their wealth and redistributed it to those leaders that within his own clan that he had promoted based upon merit. This made him very popular in the eyes of poor people, because poor people saw that there was an opportunity for promotion and advancement. So that helped him to gain a large following, and he was eventually elected leader of all the Mongols. And the way the Mongols did that, they would, a prospective ruler who wanted to be elected leader would call for a general council, and the more of his supporters who showed up, the more likely it was that he was going to be acclaimed as the leader. And that's basically what happened. Once Genghis Khan became a leader, he was very impressive and very influential. If you look at a map of the world today, you know, biggest country is Russia. And Russia, as it exists today, and has existed for hundreds of years, wouldn't be that kind of a country without Genghis Khan. Now, the Rus people are Vikings. They came down from Scandinavia, but that's the European side. Most of Russia, landmass-wise, is in Asia, not in Europe. And there would be no unification of European and Asian Russia as Russia without Genghis Khan having conquered all of it and ruled it. And he came out of Mongolia and across to do that. One of his failures as a leader, though, is that he was not really an administrator. He was a general, he was a warrior, he inspired people, he incredibly conquered massive amounts of territory in a short amount of time. Does he sound familiar? He's sort of like Alexander the Great, a great general, a great leader, but not really a skilled administrator. Now, Alexander the Great died young, so he didn't really even have a chance to put into place a succession plan. But Genghis Khan, once he died, his empire kind of fell apart. Pieces of it remained very strong because his sons and grandsons were very powerful men. So the Mongols continued to dominate a huge portion of the world for a long period of time. But he himself did not leave an intact empire because it fell apart soon after his death. Okay, so characteristics of Genghis Khan's army. It was an army of archers on horseback, which was made them incredibly mobile, fast, and they could also kill lots of people from a long ways away. So, you know, as opposed to traditional European cavalry and even Muslim cavalry, where, you know, you have lances and swords and axes, people on horseback, and then you would have archers who were standing on the ground in one place. The idea of an army that's primarily made up of mounted archers who shoot with deadly accuracy from the back of a moving horse was an innovation that Europeans and Arabs were not prepared for. And so that was just devastating when these hordes of Mongols would sweep across and totally decimate armies. It was a type of warfare that no one else in the world had ever practiced. They were also really good at siege warfare, particularly with their intimidation tactics. And they also used gunpowder, and they built ships, and so they had more than just archers on horseback. But the archers on horseback are really the key to what made them different and what made them effective. So then John Green gives you sort of 5 reasons why the Mongols were awesome and 5 reasons why the Mongols were not so awesome. 5 reasons why they were awesome. They reinvigorated the cross-Eurasian trade. So the Silk Road had kind of fallen into disuse after the collapse of the Roman Empire and the sort of disintegration of Europe into a bunch of little city-states. The Mongols really reinvigorated that Silk Road trade. They increased communication across Eurasia by using a Pony Express type system of riders who would carry news very quickly from one end of the empire to the other. Security was great, because people were so afraid of the Mongols that they wouldn't dare attack anyone who was under Mongol protection. Culinary expansion. I just got back from Israel, and in Israel there's lots of rice in the diet, as there is in most Middle Eastern diets. Persian, Afghan, Israeli, Arab diet now has lots of rice in it. Well, rice comes from China. How did it get over there? Well, the Mongols did that. That's why I was eating rice in Israel. It's because of the Mongols. And also the Mongols, when they found somebody who knew something that they could use, they would relocate them. So you could be in, Russia, and they might move you to India because they needed your skill set there. That wasn't very nice for the person who was being moved, but it was good in terms of spreading knowledge around. And the 5th thing, and this is really key, is that the Mongols were very tolerant of other religions because they believed that their gods were basically only local deities there in Mongolia. They accepted whatever god the people they conquered wanted to worship. And religious freedom is a very good thing that creates any type of human freedom is a good thing. All right, not so awesome. Genghis Khan really liked conquering people. That was his joy, his happiness. What made him happy, his love language was conquering and decimating people. And boy, when they conquered, they conquered. They were brutal. They destroyed and they stole and they enslaved. It was really, really harsh. And their empire didn't last very long. And they were not interested in art and architecture. They were a nomadic people. And they were probably the people most responsible for the Black Death coming to Europe. Not so much because they would at times catapult corpses who had died of the Black Death over walls of cities they were sieging. Very nice tactic there. But mostly because of their trade routes that they established brought rats from the east to the west, and those rats carried the Black Death. So he's the one most responsible for half of the population of Europe being killed in the 1300s due to the Black Death. Okay, we're less than a half an hour into the video. We're down to our last of 4 videos we're going over, and this is on the monsoon market, as John Green cleverly designates it. You can see the map here. There are these seasonal monsoons. From November to February, they blow from north to south, and then from April to September, they blow from south to north. So this made this whole network of trade possible because these strong trade winds, they're actually called trade winds now instead of just monsoons, because they are winds that promote seasonal trade. Compared to the Silk Road, the trade on the Indian Ocean was bigger, richer, and supported a more diverse group of merchants. The height of that Indian Ocean trade was between the years 1000 and 1200. And who was involved? Well, all the areas that you see on the map. The Swahili kingdoms of East Africa, the Arab traders of the Middle East, the Indian traders along the coast, and then the Far Eastern traders of Indonesia and Southeast Asia, and even into China. So when you're connecting China to Africa in the year 1000, that's a pretty impressive trade route. The Indian Ocean trade route took off and became popular because it offered people a wide range of import needs, from ivory to timber to books to grain. A large number of things could be traded that people needed. The monsoons were these seasonal winds that helped to make the trade reliable and possible. Muslims were the ones who dominated the trade in this area because they were wealthy enough to be able to build ships, and the ships were the ones that carried the cargo, and so that was the really the heart of the trade. The terms of trade were primarily determined by the merchants themselves and by the demands of the market, and not by political leaders, and that was an important innovation. So you're starting to get a market-based economy, and politics is having to sort of serve the purpose of the market and not just their own interests. And so how else was the Indian Ocean trade route different from the Silk Road? Because there were bulk goods. So when you're talking about a camel caravan or donkeys or mules or carts, there's only so much you can put on them. And primarily what was traded along the Silk Road were very expensive objects like silk and jade and gold and emeralds for rich people. So it was kind of a rich person's trinket market, right? The ships, though, ships can hold massive amounts of goods: rice, timber, ivory. And so these were bulk goods for the mass market. These were not just, this was not about trade for the elite. This was trade for everybody. What else was traded besides goods? This part made me frustrated, because John Green mentions technology and the Muslim faith, which are true. Technology was traded around, the magnetic compass and the astrolabe and the triangular sail. The Muslim faith was also spread, but he leaves out the fact that slaves were traded. Millions of slaves were traded along this trade route by Muslims, but that's something that he just doesn't seem to want to talk about. Okay, so how did trade in the Indian Ocean determine the geography and demographics of the region? It's because these powerful merchant states could control the trade waters and tax the ships to enrich their empire. So lots of areas became wealthy and powerful because they were on trade routes. On the other hand, number 10, if the taxes were too high, the merchants could always go elsewhere. So the political leaders became more powerful and wealthy, but they were limited by the realities of the fact that they were dependent upon trade for their wealth. All right, so those are the questions and answers for videos 15 through 18. I know I flew through them relatively quickly, but it's a video, so you can always go back and rewind and pause as needed. So I'll see you in class on Thursday. Your papers are due to me in class on Thursday, or via email is even better. If you're going to email it to me, please email it to me in a Word document format. That's how I really prefer to grade things. It just makes it a lot easier all around. And so remember, you're writing about either Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar or the rise of Christianity in the first 300 years, and you're comparing and contrasting John Green's interpretation with Rodney Stark's interpretation, and your thesis statement is basically, who do you think is right, or who do you think is more close to accurate, or what do you think is the truth about it? And then you're going to be comparing and contrasting according to the outline format that I gave you. So that is it for now, and I will see you in class on Thursday. Thanks. Bye.